Welcome to the quarterly webinar that's organized by Cure Parkinson's, Journal of Parkinson's Disease, and Van Andel Institute. Today, the theme is Young Onset Parkinson's Disease. And soon you will hear that is actually a concept that can be discussed on its own for a long time. What is young onset? But it's also a very interesting and important topic in terms of how people with young onset Parkinson's are treated, what the underlying biology is, what the special challenges are for those affected by Parkinson's earlier in life. So my name is Patrick Brunden. I'm in Van Andel Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I'm going to chair this session. I'm going to ask all our panelists to introduce themselves. Before I do that, I just want to let everybody know you can ask questions and you can go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and there you can pose your questions. We have over 200 people registered today, so we're going to have a lot of questions coming in. And therefore, we have a couple of people in the background who are helping us go through these questions and trying to group them. We're not going to be able to answer all of them, but we'll try to do our best to answer the most common and pressing issues. And we, actually they, because I'm just going to be the moderator, the ones who are going to answer these will now introduce themselves. So I'm going to start the way I see you in my window with you, Bart. Who are you, Bart?
Thank you, Patrick. I'm Bart Post. I'm a neurologist in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and I focus my research and clinical practice, especially on young onset Parkinson's disease.
Thank you. And Veerle, tell us about yourself.
Hi, Patrick. My name is Veerle Aartse. I got diagnosed back in 2010 at the age of 38 with young onset Parkinson's disease. I'm a mom of 4, divorced, and I've been a fierce advocate ever since. For 2 years, I've now been the vice chair of RadioReg, which is the rare disease organization in Belgium, because in our country, young onset Parkinson's disease is recognized as a rare disease.
Thank you for joining us, Veerle. We look forward to your perspective in this. And Rodolfo, who are you?
Hello, hi. I'm Rodolfo Savica. I'm one of the consultants on neurology at the Mayo Clinic Rochester, and I'm leading the effort on the young onset Parkinson's disease clinic, and my own lab works on mostly young onset Parkinson's disease.
Thank you, Rodolfo. And Sarah, tell us about yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sara Vandres. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Laboratory of Neurogenetics at the National Institute on Aging at NIH in the United States, and I focus my research on young onset Parkinson's disease genetics.
Thank you so much. So going into this webinar, I thought the concept of young onset Parkinson's disease was going to be pretty easy to define, and we've been meeting for about half an hour before this webinar, and I realized I was wrong. And you're going to hear why I was wrong and how I was wrong when we ask the first question: what is meant by young onset Parkinson's disease? I'm going to let Rodolfo and maybe Bart start this discussion. And rather than going on for an hour, which we could do, we're going to limit it a little bit, but you'll see how complex it is and why.
So yeah, sure. So the concept of young onset Parkinson's disease lays upon the fact that everybody that is having the onset of disease before the more common age of Parkinson's disease onset, which is about 65 to 70 years of age, can be potentially considered young. In other words, everything that happens before the cutoff of age was in the past considered young onset. And I think this concept still stands as a whole. That's why sometimes it's better to go in this situation if you think 65 and below early onset, because it's earlier than the most frequent age of onset of Parkinson's disease. However, the concept of young lays upon the fact that the individuals that are affected by this condition before the most usual age of onset are usually younger individuals, are usually people that are working in the working force, they're having their own life, they're having their own problems, as we all have. They have family, they have kids, they have boyfriend, girlfriend, they're having a whole life that they have to consider. and it's not happening toward the end of our active life in the Western society. The problem is that it's very difficult from a research standpoint, if we scout the literature, if we browse the literature, identifying a clear age of cutoff of age for this condition. There are organizations that are thinking, rightfully so, that below 40 years of age, below 45 years of age, it's indeed the group of patients called young onset Parkinson disease. But I would argue with that somebody that is 51 can be incredibly young, can be incredibly active, fit, able to work toward their life, and having 10, 15, 20 years of employment, of activities that he or she would like to do. So many societies now are trying to identify a cutoff, an age cutoff, and we were talking half an hour before, we will never come with a clear understanding and a clear agreement. So we have to try to find a way, but would be fair to say that everybody that is a biological age considered young for our society, which would be before the common usual way of onset of Parkinson's disease, can be considered earlier or younger. And maybe there's a population that has the onset in their 20s, 30s, that are younger or juvenile. Maybe that would be a way to, make everybody happy. Why this is important? Why this is important from a standpoint of nomenclature and terminology is not just semantic, because to me, it doesn't matter if I call something a cow or a sheep. It's still an animal that I have to deal with. My problem is that when we look at the literature, if we don't have a clear cutoff of the age, it's very difficult to understand what are we talking about. How can we identify trends? How can we see if the population is increase or decrease? And even in terms of biomarker studies, genetic studies, there's a different meaning. We will see maybe later if we are looking at genetic tests in someone in their 20s and 30s, and even treatments, 20s and 30s and 40s compared to somebody's close to 60 or in their 60s. So there are some clinical and some research questions that need to be identified. But again, that is a gigantic work, and we are not going to be able to find that definition. I would say, to me, everybody that is considered young, either by society or by themselves, can be considered young onset. There's people that are way younger than the others, but still, the implications are similar if somebody is in his middle 40s or early 50s or middle 50s sometimes. Dr. Post, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
But it sounds like you're saying the most important reason that this concept exists is for research and for maybe clinical treatment guidelines.
I think
do you
so.
agree? Well, yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, I agree most part with Rodolfo. I think in clinical practice, I like to exclude the case of juvenile Parkinson. And we use the cutoff of around 20 or 21. Maybe Sarah can say something about it later on. But what we know, and I wrote a paper about it together with Victor Foong when I was in Sydney. And what we saw there is that a lot of juvenile cases are other diseases, are all kinds of metabolic diseases, and are not really, they don't really have the pathology of PD. So that's why we use the cutoff here in the Netherlands around 21. It's juvenile, it's other diseases. And then 21 and above, and we say between 40 and 50, but that's really a cutoff for the research. And because that's the group of around 5 to 10% of all PD patients. So it's a smaller group with its own questions in clinical practice. But I agree for research, we make this cutoff. For clinical practice, we do the same as Rodolfo.
I agree with the fact that juvenile should be considered differently, because obviously somebody in his 20s or in the teens usually is a different condition, or something that can look like Parkinson, but is not necessarily Parkinson.
So am I hearing then juvenile is before 20, just for today, And then
No, I think
young
so.
onset might be before the age of 40 or 50, somewhere around there. Something like that.
Yes, okay, yes.
So, of course, it has importance for understanding the disease, which I think you both mentioned. But and you also mentioned that it is important in how the disease impacts the people. And Vela, do you want to say something about being diagnosed as a young onset person? What sort of challenges do you think you have and have had that perhaps a person who's 70 wouldn't have from the same disease?
I feel young onset because everyone I talk to and I explain about my disease tells me it's oh yes, my mom or my grandma has it. And that's when you stop relating, and that's when and it impacts us differently. Because I'm still at working age, I was building up my life. It impacts your relationship, it impacts your work, it impacts your social life. And I think that's a big difference with the regular Parkinson's, because the people with all due respect who are 17 or 80, they can do with their sentiment for the rest of their lives. As young onset Parkinson people, we can't. We have still too many years to go. And there's so many misconceptions that impact our life negatively that I was so happy to read the article of Bart Post with a clear definition of the young onset Parkinson's disease.
And one question, just to let everybody know we're getting these questions. Somebody says here, it's somebody called Claire Lehman. It's a real challenge to determine how to balance career aspiration with trying to minimize stress. Yes. And any recommendations. And I think that's a great question, because of somebody who's 70, already retired, yes. Financially doesn't have to worry, yep. Totally different, right? May not have any children they need to take care of. So Vela, do you want to comment on that? What yes, could be the best way? Is there a way?
I completely agree with that, because how much I relate to older people with Parkinson's. I mean, they're talking about not being able to go on ski holiday with their grandchildren. For me, it's about being there for my kids who I can't drive or go and pick up from parties because I can't drive a car anymore. It's about feeding them in the morning because I can't get out of bed. It's about not being able to work anymore because I'm too nervous to go through an interview. It's those basic things that make a big difference. And it's also, yeah, you don't have the future you have in front of you is entirely different because I have to live day by day. So.
And many people, of course, are in childbearing age and might want to have a child, don't already have a child. And what are your thoughts around this? And maybe Rodolfo and Bart could mention how the treatment could impact pregnancy and what one has to think about or not think about.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Vela, first. Vela, what?
Yes, well, we see now more and more in the online groups where I'm a member of, more and more people who become younger and younger, or women who have kids at later age, wanting still to go through pregnancy. And there's so much still unknown about the subject. It's like a Pandora's box you open, you know. Just don't start to talk about women and hormones. Although when we share that's the good thing about on social media, we share our experience and we find our likes with people go through the same things, because we are rare, each individually, but we are such a nice large group on a global level.
And there's a comment here from somebody that as a young onset person, you may actually be taking care of kids or wanting to have kids, but you may also be the caretaker of your parents when they are elderly. So that's particularly challenging. Rodolfo, you do want to say something about the impact of treatments or no
Absolutely.
Impact of the treatments on pregnancy?
Absolutely. And I would like to preface saying also that one of the challenge that all my patients with early onset, young onset Parkinson mentions is that they, as was told by Verle, they cannot relate very well with people in their 70s or 80s and 90s. And that's why they don't have enough information. There's not support group that will match their needs, because clearly somebody in his 80s and 90s already lived their life, let me pass the term, live their life, cannot relate with somebody as young and in needs of a different kind of support and help, including the childbearing age, including having children. And actually, we were talking just, I think, 1 week ago with Dr. Post about try to explore more this topic, because if you ask me, if my patients are asking me, and Bart can tell you the same, okay, I have Parkinson's disease, I'm in my 30s or 40s, I want to have a kid, I'm getting married in 6 months, this has happened to a patient of mine, I'm getting married in 6 months, and then I want to have a kid, I'm 32. Can I have a kid safely? Can I use medication safely? Can I use carbidopa levodopa safely or dopamine agonist safely? The answer to this question is simply, we do not know. The answer is that the literature is full of holes. That's why having these initiatives like today and some of the societies scientifically are trying to finally move, getting a momentum out of this, to try to fill the gaps that our patient, then as Verla say, now is a rare disease, but thank God to social media, we are able to connect people from different parts of the world that can share the experience and can get a much larger crowd in front of them, not the only case in a group of elderly people. So from a childbearing standpoint, the questions that we really don't know, and we need to, and maybe Bart can comment on that, I cannot decide by case, being incredibly careful, being saying, okay, if you have to take Cinemet, maybe let this continue, let's see the first 3 months how you're doing, and maybe go on. I'm talking to a lot of maternal fetal specialists on that, but even them, they don't have a great opinion on that. Bart.
Well, we can say something about it. There are some reviews, but I agree with Rodolfo that literature is scarce and it's all case-based. But when you look at the reviews, what we see is that Parkinson's is, for the most patients, is they get worse during pregnancy, and then after pregnancy they get a little better again. So I think it's hormones. And we looked at all the medication, and I think of all the dopaminergic medication, it's the safest to use levodopa. If you don't have to use anything, that's even better. But if you have to use something, then use levodopa. And I want to make 2 final comments. I think it's very important to get a gynecologist on your team. We have a gynecologist on our team, and as he's dedicated to Parkinson's not only, but for 1 day in a week, she will be dedicated to Parkinson's and join our team, as he can do research, and we can use her knowledge about women and about the hormones and about some tricks also with oral contraceptives to stabilize the Parkinson's. So we already having fun of her. It is her of her expertise.
That's actually a question, Bart, in the chat about hormone therapy. So contraception or other female sex hormone therapies. How much is known about how they impact the fluctuations in response to L-DOPA, or do they impact the response to L-DOPA?
Well, we don't know that. We don't know that. What I know from literature is that women more often have dyskinesia earlier on in the disease. I don't know why that is. So maybe Sarah can say something about it later on. Maybe it's a genetic thing we know about. And the other thing is, what we hear is that a lot of patients, women, are during their periods are worse off with their PD. And sometimes we give oral contraceptives just to postpone or just eradicate the periods, and then the PD will stabilize. So, but that's case-based, of course. There's not so much usage.
That's a question that you had. I think it says here from Rochelle Flanagan: has Bart ever changed medication around menstrual cycles? But you mean you have then given medication to eliminate the cyclicity, and you say case-based, it might be a good idea, but never studied.
Case-based, yeah. And then one last thing I want to say is that Rodolfo, I, and a Scottish colleague, Kathleen Pearl, we are working on trying to get a database, like a registry for women all around the world, to register their pregnancy and see how they do during pregnancy. And we hope to gather more information about it this way.
If you allow me to say another thing about hormones, because that is very important, and we know how hormones have been studied through the years for degeneration with dementia, with Parkinson, and so forth. There are some very small studies, mostly on basic science, that shows that on how circulating estrogen misplace, so detach the L-DOPA transported in the blood when taken. So in other words, sometimes women need to be taken a little bit more L-DOPA, for example, if they have a surge of hormone. That's why there's some literature suggesting that dyskinesia is more common in women because of the amount of circulating estrogens that they have. However, it's based upon very limited studies. So we really hope that we're going to get more information and more studies to understand this very important topic that everybody, you say women, I say women for sure, but also men are having a little bit of fluctuation of hormones. They need to be studied as well. For sure women, but everybody affected, I would say.
So I see Vela was nodding ahead, and before I see if you want to make a comment, Vela, I'm just going to let everybody know we are soon going to discuss a little bit about the causes perhaps being different in young onset Parkinson's, and we're going to discuss genetics. But perhaps, Vela, do you want to make a comment that there aren't no, she doesn't want to make comment, that's fine, Vela, you can come back later. But I'll just make the comment, it sounds like young onset Parkinson's hasn't been studied enough when it comes to several things in terms of interaction with sex hormones, and as we're going to speak also later, a slightly different response to medication in the long term and a slightly different clinical course. But before we talk about the clinical course, we have two questions I want to bring up. One is from Christopher Moga. He says, my son was diagnosed at 26. I'm interested in whether young onset implies a common group of causes different from older onset PD. And I'm also interested whether that offers routes for treatment for cure, in addition to symptom management. And the other question is somewhat related. It's, oh gosh, there's so many questions now, I lost it, but it was one related to the genetics. Here we are. Where did it go? Well, I'll find it later, but I'm going to call on you, Sandra. Can you provide some clarity? People with young onset PD, are they different in terms of genetic causes? Are there more inherited cases in young onset PD? What do we know about genes in that case? And what's the difference between a familial form and one just being caused by lots of genetic risk or being with contributions from lots of genetic risk? So you're going to speak a lot about this, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I think I will start talking a little bit about genetics and the genome in general for people that are not familiar with it. So just for you to know, our genome contains information, of course, about what we are in terms of, physical characteristics, of course, but also in terms of susceptibility of diseases, no? And in this case, young onset Parkinson disease. So our genome is tremendously large. So it contains like about 3 billion tiny letters, right? That contains basically the instructions, everything we need to determine like how every cell of our organism should work. Based on that, you can imagine how much information is within our DNA, right? Our genomic information comes like half from our mom and half from our dad. And definitely genetics plays a key role in young onset Parkinson's disease. But I have to say that it was not until, long time ago that researchers and clinicians thought that Parkinson's disease was not a genetics disorder. And I have to say that our understanding of the genetics underlying Parkinson's disease has grown incredibly over the last 20 years. And we now know that there are, several genes that are obviously responsible for young onset Parkinson's disease, in which there are, I would say, rare and very deleterious genetic variants that cause disease by altering different biological pathways. And in the case of young onset Parkinson's disease, I will say that there are genes that are linked to autosomal recessive pattern of inheritance, which in
you have to explain that.
Yes, which in easy.
So what is recessive?
Yeah, I'm about to explain that. So in easy words means that basically you have to inherit a mutated copy from your mom and another mutated copy from your dad to develop disease. And if you do not inherit both, it will not cause disease. So this is the recessive pattern of inheritance. This means that your parents are carriers for those mutated copies, but they do not present with the disease. And this is the case for some genes, like for instance, PAR2, PIN1, or DJ1, that are responsible of young onset Parkinson's disease. And then, of course, we have autosomal dominant inheritance, which means that if you inherit one mutated copy, this is enough to cause disease. And this is what we observe, for instance, in synuclein, the SNCA gene that encodes synuclein is the main histopathological hallmark of Parkinson's disease, and is also, point mutations in this gene cause young onset Parkinson's disease. So yeah, there are definitely differences in how we inherit these variants and how these cause disease. And regarding your second question, the genetics underlying late onset Parkinson's disease or sporadic disease and young onset Parkinson's disease is really different. We say that, in fact, Parkinson's disease etiology lies more on a continuum, right, that goes from Mendelian inheritance, which is these monogenic forms of disease that I have just described, and that occurs in a very small proportion of forms of disease, of Parkinson's disease. This, as I said, is caused by very, very deleterious mutations in regions of the genome that are going to be highly functional, are going to be crucial for a certain molecular pathway. And then we have some other type of inheritance, that is the complex inheritance, that is what is contributing to late onset Parkinson's disease. And this is more thought to be caused by, an interplay between a large number of genetic variants that individually are going to slightly increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. And these are—
Sorry, can I interrupt you there, Sarah? When you say a large number, so you as a geneticist, how many genes are you thinking of could be contributing to this genetic risk?
Yeah, so far there are about 90 risk loci, so 90 independent signals that have been associated with late onset Parkinson's disease or sporadic disease. And these are the ones that are predisposing to disease. If you inherit one, nothing happens because they exert small effects on disease, but when they accumulate—
Just to give us a sense, that small effect, so tell the audience, so if you don't have that risk locus yourself versus having it, how much does your risk typically increase if you take an average risk locus, one of those 90?
Yeah, so they exert like 1.02 times more likely to develop disease. So it's really, really small for each of those particular variants, but when they are cumulatively, they can increase risk up to 6-fold. So it's quite a lot when considered cumulatively, and also when you are exposed to certain environmental factors at the same time.
And I've heard that those risk loci are not necessarily, or typically not in the genes, but they're in areas that regulate genes. So if you have 90 of those locations, how many genes, just to give people a sense of how complicated this is, how many genes could be affected by those 90 loci?
Yeah, so many of them. So we are actually trying to unravel those signals around those loci, because these are usually intergenic. These are in the genome. Sometimes we do not exactly what are the causal variants. This is something that that's why geneticists work a lot with cell biologists, and we try to integrate our work in order to unravel the cause. But there are definitely many genes that can be within a certain locus, that is a region of the genome. So yeah, many small contributors.
So I can tell the audience here that Sarah is one of the most prominent people in the world doing this, and you do a lot of complicated mathematics to understand this. It's not just Gregor Mendel looking at a couple of beans that have different colors. It's very, very complicated math. So you're a bioinformatician now, rather than a person who looks at simple inheritance.
Yeah, exactly. I actually wanted to go back to one of the questions. I think it was mentioned about dyskinesia. So we actually try to connect genotypes to phenotypes in Parkinson's disease, but this is really a big challenge for us, And we do not have many answers yet, I have to say, because to study these, you need patients that have been followed by many, many years. So you need a lot of data with standardized clinical measurements. And the problem is that even if you have that data, that longitudinal data, because of course there are initiatives that are very promising, there is a lot of clinical heterogeneity, as it has been mentioned at the beginning as well, right? Between those patients to kind of tease apart what variants are associated specifically with certain phenotypes versus other, like in Parkinson's disease.
And we got a very specific question from Rochelle Flanagan again. I think it's for you, Sarah. Could you say approximately what percentage of young onset Parkinson's is genetic? And I presume the question is then monogenetic familial.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think this is a great question. So actually there has been a recent study and found that about 65% of people with Parkinson's disease onset under 20 years old, and about, I think it's 32% of people with onset between 20 and 30 years are affected by a non-rare deleterious genetic cause. However, I would like to say there are many cases that certainly we know are genetic due to their family history, but the genetic cause underlying is unknown yet for us. And there is definitely a lot to be found in terms of genetics, and this is what we call the missing heritability of disease, right? There is a lot of genetic variation that is nowadays tricky to uncover. Just because of the current technologies that we have that are very difficult, are tricky to kind of unravel rare variation, structural variation, and different genetics that are underlying Parkinson's disease with young onset.
So Vela, as somebody who is affected by young onset Parkinson's, what are the thoughts in the community about genetic testing, specifically for people with young onset?
I think.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Is it?
Sorry.
I think it would be good, as the cost of whole genome sequencing is coming down, that people who are diagnosed as young in their young ages are getting tested, together with the help of obviously genetic counseling, because the test itself doesn't ring a bell. But I think it's a good starting point to see and to start off further.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The thing is that only a small proportion of patients with young onset Parkinson's disease nowadays have like an identifiable, like a genetic cause that can be identified, right? Yes. So the confusion here comes when a genetic test comes like negative and the patient says, okay, so the cause of Parkinson's disease here is not genetic, and this is always not true, because it might be just that your genetic cause has not been discovered yet, no? And this sometimes leads to confusion. So I agree with what you've said. Like, I would say that genetic testing should be available, but only if it's followed by proper genetic counseling, for sure.
And we have a question, maybe Bart, you could tackle this. Well, we know actually, but can you describe how young onset Parkinson's disease presents differently to the classical Parkinson's disease in older age? And of course, with the genetic makeup of the disease being different, that's understandable, but can you describe how do patients typically progress in young onset, and how do they respond to medication? And Rodolfo, you're also welcome, of course, in this.
Yeah, I can say something about it. First, I want to say a little thing about genetic testing, because in the Netherlands, we have rules for it. So I think it's different everywhere around the world. So in the Netherlands, it's under 40, we can offer it. And if there is a first grade family member, then we offer it. And we offer a panel of several genes, and we screen them. So we don't do whole exome sequencing most of the time, only in research. And then on to the clinical things. Well, what's really different, I think, when on presentation is that you see a lot of dystonia. Of course, PD is bradykinesia, rigidity on one side, slowly progressive, but you see a lot of dystonia, and I think around 20 to 30% of young onset patients, as opposed to older onset patients like 65 or 70, it's only 5% at the beginning. So a lot more dystonia, even exercise-induced dystonia as the first symptom, especially when doing sports. We do a lot of cycling in the Netherlands, of course, and we have patients, they can't cycle anymore because their foot is inverted. And well, and then reaction to medication. Well, we give levodopa to all ages. I don't know how it is in the other parts of the world, but we left a dopamine agonist for young onset patient as first choice. I want to say first choice because we start with levodopa, we go low and slow to treat it.
Can you just explain why you chose not to start with dopamine agonists?
Yeah, I can explain it. We switched recently, and one of the important things is the LEAP study. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine 2 years ago. And what we saw there, even in young patients, if you start really early with levodopa, you get a good response. And what we are afraid of in levodopa is dyskinesia. And dyskinesia you see it more often in younger patients, but you see it mostly driven by disease duration. So, and if you give agonists, they're less effective. So levodopa is more effective. So we choose in the beginning for low levodopa, because that's the best way of treating patients for a good quality of life. And in the end, when you get this wearing off, then we add the dopamine agonist. And one other issue that's why we use levodopa first is the impulse control disorders. You see them, especially in young men, you see them much more often, up to 20%, and lifetime prevalence around 50. So that's another important reason. So on one side, levodopa is more effective, and you have the impulse controllers more often in the dopamine agonist. So that's the most important 2 reasons to start levodopa, even if you're in your 20s and in your 30s, but stay low, go slow. And then one last thing before I hand it over to Rodolfo about prognosis, because what we know from literature, and that's really typical, I don't know how to explain it, but we see a much slower progression in young onset patients. So without doubt, patients who have 30 years of Parkinson's, they started in their 20s or in their 30s. And I don't know what happens there, but it's there. We call it the paradox of getting young onset, because you don't want to be, don't want to live for 40 years with this disease. But on the other end, you don't want to progress in 10 years to really be disabled. So that's what I have to say about these topics.
So the disease progresses more slowly, the responses to drugs slightly different, and we heard from Sarah that genetics are different. In fact, I have a very specific question as we go over to Rodolfo, and this is maybe you can answer for your clinic, at Mayo Clinic, very specialized, but what proportion of young onset Parkinson's actually undergo genetic testing? Do you have a feeling for that?
Sure, absolutely. I would say, to answer this question, I would say in my personal clinic, in our Mayo Clinic, we have a very broad, multidisciplinary, almost holistic approach where we have many different figures. We have sport medicine, integrative medicine involved, genetic counseling. Every patient that comes to my clinic, they're undergoing 2 genetic tests. Usually is a commercial available test that is about 16 genes, and most of my patients are negative. So then we have to do the whole genome sequences, as Dr. Post says and Alberta says, is mostly for research, but it's the way to understand that, as Dr. Bandresiga was saying, if somebody is genetically negative for this commercial available test, doesn't mean that the genes are not involved. It means that these genes that are the most common causative genes that are causing the disease are not positive. But the role of genes is way complicated, and Dr. Bandresiga made a very good summary of that. But also another thing that we have is that we don't know about the protective genes. We know nothing about protective genes. We don't know how much protective genes are interacting with the risk factor genes, and on how the sex chromosomes X and Y are having a role into that, which is a major failure of the entire field, not just in Parkinson, but in many conditions. In other words, it's much more complicated. Getting a negative test doesn't mean that you're negative, it means that we don't know yet what is going to be happening in the future. And even having a positive test doesn't necessarily mean doesn't necessarily mean that the disease will be inevitable, because there can be protective genes that are inactivate or block the gene to some extent. So it's much more complicated. That's why we have this more comprehensive approach to try to look at different level the complexity of this condition that is completely different than what we do in late onset Parkinson's disease. I agree with Dr. Post. We use carbidopa-levodopa because we need to help patients, as Verla said, now, day by day, in the now. We don't know what would happen in the future, but if somebody has diabetes that needs insulin, we will give insulin. We will not give oral glycemic agent. It's not going to work. So when we prefer to start low, as Dr. Post says, slow, avoiding impulse control disorder that are present in 30%, if not more, of patients that are using with Parkinson's disease. And it's important to say, sometimes these impulse control disorder are not massive. They are not destroying your life. Sometimes they're very intrusive. They're like extreme hobbying. If somebody likes to read and reads 9 hours per day, is a normal hobby, but it's becoming intrusive in the life. So it's very important to consider this topic. I completely agree with Dr. Post. The entire idea is to incorporate, to me, the way I foresee this for the future for genetic testing, that every patient should be tested genetically, hopefully with a more comprehensive gene, hopefully with all genome sequences, and all the effort of people that are involved with taking care of these patients should be holistic, multidisciplinary, and harmonized. In fact, me and Dr. Post are working already in trying to harmonize our clinical efforts in 2 different continents in order to provide a homogeneous approach to the condition.
So you use the word holistic, and there's a question I think that touches upon this. The disease affects the whole family, and we talked earlier about young onset Parkinson's patients being at a fertile age, may already have children. Velo, would you want to comment? There's a question, what support is there out there for young children who have a parent with young onset PD, especially regarding familial PD? Because as scientists, we want to know the genetic background, and we'll find out that there's a gene that's related to young onset in this family, but there are no treatments that can stop it if it is inherited. So is there anything there, Vela?
No, there is none whatsoever. And it is my main frustration, because MS Association, other patient organizations, they support their families, because it's normal for MS patients to have children of like teenager or young family. And for Parkinson's, there's none. So I really think we are now getting more and more focused on young onset Parkinson, that there comes a movement where there's separate patient organization who help patients also in house settings, who help also on different levels. We've started a survey, which will be global survey led by patients for patients. It will, more information hopefully will follow soon. We're collaborating to that. And the aim is to get the support that is needed, which is only fair because there's so many, globally, there's so many people of us living with the disease and encountering the same problems where we don't get any help with.
And I think it's interesting that there's always been a need for support for the whole family, but with young onset, with the genetics, you add an additional level of complexity, because the children may then know that they're at greater risk. And my dad was diagnosed when I was 13. And of course, in those days, there was no internet. So I didn't know of anybody else who had a father who had Parkinson's, and there was no possibility to connect. Now, I think a good thing is that there are children's books about Parkinson's disease. Sonia Matur has written a couple I know, and that can help explain to the children and provide some support. But I want to come back to this issue. I think the discussion, I want to thank you all for this, and I want to thank the people asking questions, because this is really interesting. But you've really painted a picture of a rather different disease in terms of genetics, different disease in the course of it, the implications for the people affected because they're in an earlier phase in life, the way they respond to medication. And somebody pointed out very early on, shouldn't there be a special, like a task force addressing young onset Parkinson's, because it is such a different entity. And I see people waving their hands off screen, and there is a task force. Maybe Bart, Rodolfo, and Vela wanted to speak to this. What should be done in the future about young onset Parkinson's? And I want to add before we go there that we talked about the genetics through Sarah. It's different, but we also know that if you look at the brain in the microscope, somebody who's passed away with young onset, the pathology isn't identical in many cases to the regular garden variety later onset Parkinson. So definitely a different biology. But this task force, who wants to put up their hand if you want to talk about a task force? Rodolfo, go ahead, you start.
Let me start for the last concept that is very important. So I think the major mistake that we did as a group, as a scientist, as a physician, was that we adopted knowledge of late onset Parkinson disease into the young onset Parkinson disease. The knowledge that we acquired through decades on late onset Parkinson disease may not apply or barely applies to early onset to young onset Parkinson disease. Sometimes, so the entire idea is that, as you say, there are some conditions, there are some situations where the Lewy bodies, the accumulation of alpha-synuclein is not even present. And the symptoms of degeneration of the substantia nigra or damage of the substantia nigra, which is the area responsible for some of the symptoms, is a common outcome of many different conditions, of many different biochemical mechanisms that can be caused by several different metabolic pathways that are driven by a genetic background, driven by environmental background, driven by personal background to some extent. So clearly, we as a group, we need to work together. We need to spearhead the research. We need to have this kind of conversation, helping Foundation, NIH, UK Brain Bank, Europe, Asia, doesn't matter, to fund research devoted to understand the subtype and the characteristic of early onset Parkinson disease. Personally, I am the chair of the early onset Parkinson disease task force of the Movement Disorder Society. Dr. Poss is part of that as well. And there was a task force that didn't exist before. It just started now. To me, that is kind of concerning, because this means that up to this point, 50 years, 40 years in the revolution of Parkinson disease, 20 years in the genetic revolution of the 90s of genome, and years in the idea of individualized medicine. We are not even considering, nobody has considered formally to this point, this condition that is inherently different biologically, mechanistically, and pathologically, socially, personally, compared to the rest. And that is, to me, something that we have to work as a group. Maybe, this conversation will spearhead additional conversation, will span more interest, and will help identify funding mechanisms just devoted to early onset Parkinson disease. And not just for my lab, for anybody's. We need to communicate. We need to make sure that as a society, taking advantage of the fantastic network of patients that Verle was mentioning here, we will be able to identify and include more people, because ultimately we need to cure this problem. We need to cure this condition. And maybe we will not be able to cure everyone. Maybe we'll be able to cure just a percentage of patients that have a specific characteristic, but that would be a start. That would help understanding what is the condition and how can we apply this knowledge to other diseases. And
so Rodolfo, you mentioned Vela here, and I know, Vela, you're involved in a survey that's being prepared ahead of the World Parkinson Congress that's hopefully going to be held in Barcelona in 2022, if we get rid of this pandemic. And you're working with Bart on this questionnaire, fingers crossed that we can go there. Can you tell us a little bit about the survey and how you think the people who are young onset PD can get involved?
Well, it will be translated in all languages. It should be for everyone. It will be distributed by patients, by the organization of WPC itself and the EPD as well. But we are also, normally your pathway starts at when you get your diagnosis, and from there it starts. And what happened before is of no relevance. And we're really trying we're still at the stage where we're thinking how to ask the right question and what those questions are, how they grew up, how people grew up, if there were any other illnesses that occurred. So I'm sure everyone who wants, because it's a lot of work, we need lots of people. Anyone who's interested or to participate can contact via the Q Parkinson's. But I'm so happy to hear Rodolfo and Bart Post about we need to change how we deal with young onset. And it is a separate disease, and we can only move forward by addressing that issue. And it's so important that to hear that we're slowly getting there. But if we all collaborate, I believe, between clinicians, researchers, patient advocates, patient organizations, I'm sure things will change soon, and it gives me lots of hope.
Thank you. And Bart, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, what I really liked about the survey is that it started with the patient. It's coming from the patient. It's the patient's perspective that we are looking at. And we have several professionals who come in and add their view. And together we have a nice survey, I think. So it will be interesting from a more scientific point of view. What are the important problems? Are there any prodromal things different in young onset, for example, but especially the impact. And I'm really looking forward to get the data about the women part, because that's really an area of underserved area. So, but especially the initiative coming from the patients and then the professionals joining in, I really love that. And well, I think we're going to make a nice survey, and we hope to present the data in Barcelona.
I think it's only by collaborating with all different stakeholders that we're going to get a change, and it's so needed. And it feels like 50 years ago, people died from cancer, whether it was lung cancer or brain cancer. Now it's by defining those subtypes that you get results. And I think the same will happen with Parkinson's. There's so many unknowns, also for regulars. But by looking at us, we can still, I mean, if we're not too nervous, we can still express what we experience. And by doing that, we will get to the right target.
Yeah, and I would like to add something about that point, Bill. I think is great. I believe that really uncovering the genetic causes underlying young onset Parkinson's disease has been really key to unravel molecular pathways associated with disease. So there is hope there. And for instance, I have the example, some success has been seen in regard with the autosomal recessive genes that I mentioned, like PARK2, PIN1, DJ1, that are, share a common molecular pathway that is the mitochondrial quality control, for instance, and regulation. And this, I think, has really important implications for drug development, in the sense that, if you know that this pathway is clearly affecting young onset Parkinson's disease, you are going to work on developing therapeutic strategies that are going to correct that underlying cause rather than the symptoms. That is what we have at the moment. And there are many variations of Parkinson's disease or flavors of disease, as Rodolfo was pointing. And, in that sense, we need to look at the disease from different perspectives. And when you look at the disease from the molecular perspective, is certainly different. And this is important as we start thinking about precision and personalized medicine, of course.
And that's a great point, Sarah, because of the studies partly coming out of the Canadian teams, where they've seen in animal models of young onset disease that infections can trigger the disease mechanism if you have these Parkin mutations. And your own work, Sarah, not just in young onset Parkinson's, but in general Parkinson's, implicating that somehow the immune system is involved. Maybe you could share your paper from about 10 months ago. What were the main molecular pathways that seemed to be important?
Yeah, so we performed like a large scale unbiased approach to study the cumulative effect of multiple pathways on disease risk on Parkinson's disease. And we saw that the innate immune response, and we saw different, and we managed to prioritize some targets by using different algorithms and methodological approaches. And there are definitely a lot of candidates there that are involved in the immune response from different perspectives. So this is definitely something to further study. Yeah.
So that survey for the World Parkinson Congress upcoming 2022 in Barcelona, that survey could be important also in gathering information about other things that affect the risk that are environmental. You mentioned other diseases, Vela, I think will be in the survey. Do you want to add to that, Vela?
Yes, also, we will also ask the patients what they themselves think might have been the cause of their Parkinson's. And I think that has never been asked before, but that's a valid question that doesn't come into the clinical practice. So asking the patients what they think caused them, because obviously for ourselves, we might know, we might have an idea, but it's unfunded, but and by getting those answers to a question like that, it might change the view. And something else. Yes.
We sometimes don't appreciate how important just regular clinical observation can be for research. And one example is the discovery of one of the greatest genetic risk factors for Parkinson's, which is the GBA mutation, was discovered by a pediatrician who saw that there were many people in the waiting room of her waiting room, Ellen Sidransky. She was treating young people with Gaucher's disease. There weren't many relatives who seemed to have Parkinson's disease in the waiting room. And that started a long process. And, you know, clinical observation can sometimes be very, very important in the most odd ways. All right, let me just, we're coming to a close soon, but I want to bring up a couple of questions that have come in the chat. Those questions we couldn't answer, we'll try to get back to you, maybe post some articles on the website. This whole webinar will be on YouTube later, and you can see it there whenever you want to. And I think there are lots of questions about L-DOPA and what's a low dose and so on. I think we can probably find good review articles there. But let me just highlight another question that came up. Exercise in young onset Parkinson's. I heard Bart said that the dystonia that is associated with young onset Parkinson's can be troublesome if you're a cyclist. Now, only a Dutch person would bring that up, but are there other forms, or Belgian, sorry, I know the Belgians are good at cycling, but are there other forms of exercise that you think might be beneficial in specifically in young, oh, sorry, Italians are good at cycling too. I see Rodolfo, I apologize. and Spaniard, we have the cycling nations in front of us, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. But are there other forms of exercise also you could recommend? Do you think that there is some tentative evidence could be good in young onset Parkinson's?
Yeah, what we wrote, we did an RCT here in our group together with Bas Bloom, because he's really into exercise, as a lot of you know. And what we showed is that aerobic exercise 3 times a week for like 45 minutes, so really raising your heart rate. But don't get anaerobic, so don't get your well, we call it in Dutch verzuring. I don't know the English word. That's what you should do, and then the motor symptoms are getting better. But it's not only for young onsets; that's also for all PD patients. So that's what we recommend to all our patients on exercise. And it don't have to be cycling. You can do rowing. You can do walking, you can do running, but you should get your heart rate up, and you should be there for around 30 to 40 minutes and do it 3 times a week. So that's what we say about exercise to our patients. And
sounds tough.
Yeah, but it's still, well, people, a lot of people, they ask us, what can we do? And we say you can do 3 things. Look at your look at the things you eat. Exercise and do something about stress, and so how to manage stress. Yeah.
So I'm going to stress you now, because we have 1 minute 45 seconds to go. We had a suggestion one could do tango. So each one of you can say 1 word or maybe 3 words to respond to this question from one of our listeners. What would be the most impactful action that the young onset Parkinson's disease community could take collectively to benefit research and accelerate a cure? 1 thing. That's a challenge. Go ahead, Vela.
Collaborate.
Collaborate.
I would say collaborate, 3 words. Collaborate, advocate, in maybe different order, advocate, collaborate, and push. Push foundation, push governments, push agency to devote.
Lobby.
Correct. I want to say lobby. I say push, but lobby.
And Sarah, what do you say? You're not allowed to say sequence.
Yeah, I mean, I will be a little bit more specific, and I will say join the Global Parkinson's Disease Genetics Initiative by donating your sample and getting involved, because we need your collaboration, your cooperation to study your genetics and to see what are the pathways underlying disease.
So donate DNA.
Donate.
And Bart, and you're not allowed to say cycle, Bart.
I say registry. So
Registry.
we need a registry for young onsets.
We have 5 seconds.
So
I want to thank you all. This was great, a great discussion, and I hope we can all meet in some other context in real life soon. If not soon, at least in Barcelona, 2022 at the World Parkinson Congress. So thank you, everybody, and to everybody listening and asking questions. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And thank you to our sponsors.